I stood at the edge of the forest, watching the strange blue light flicker from the horizon. The light pulsed in the distance like a distant heartbeat, casting eerie shadows across the terrain. The skies overhead were heavy with clouds, the air thick with the acrid scent of ozone. This planet, which I had crash-landed on a week ago, was a far cry from what I had hoped. There had been no human settlement, no sign of rescue, just the raw wilderness. My ship was wrecked beyond repair, its pieces scattered across the landscape. There was no way off the planet. I wasn't alone here, though. At least, not entirely. There were other survivors, my fellow passengers from the crash. They weren't human, though. They were the Vokari, a species of sentient alien beings. Their silver skin glimmered under the moonlight, and their eyes, large and glowing, reflected the anxiety that filled the air. They had been on their way to a peaceful trade meeting when our ship had been torn apart by an unexpected asteroid field. In the aftermath of the crash, I became their reluctant caretaker. The Vokari were technologically advanced, but their biology was fragile. They couldn't survive on the food we humans consumed, and I had no idea how to get the resources they needed to stay alive. The week that followed had been grueling. I scavenged the wreckage, using what little tech I had to try and send a distress signal, but it was no use. The ship's systems were damaged beyond recognition, and there was no way to communicate with the outside world. The Vokari, weakened and unable to forage for themselves, had relied on me for survival. I couldn't leave them to die, even though I was on the brink of starvation myself. The worst part was knowing that there was nothing I could do to ease their suffering. Every attempt to find food for them had failed. The few plants I found on the planet's surface were toxic to them, and the native wildlife was either too fast to catch or too dangerous to approach. My resources were running low, and I was beginning to fear the worst. But then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I stumbled upon a small supply cache buried deep in the forest. It wasn't much, just enough to feed a small group for a few days, but it was food, real food, the kind the Vokari could eat without risking their lives. When I returned to the crash site, I was met with their hollow stares. I could see the exhaustion in their eyes, the desperation. It was clear that they were at the edge of their endurance. I approached them carefully, holding up the small ration packs I had found. I found something, I said, my voice cracking. One of the Vokari, a female with shimmering lavender eyes, was the first to approach. Her name was Kelari, and she had been the most vocal of the group since our crash. There was a certain grace to her despite her weakened state, a quiet strength that I had admired since the moment I met her. She took the ration pack from my hand, her fingers trembling. Her eyes flickered to the others, and for a moment there was silence. I could feel the weight of their collective gaze on me, their hope and fear intertwined. Kelari's lips parted, but no words came. She simply held the ration pack to her chest, her eyes welling up with tears. I hadn't seen her cry before. The Vokari were a stoic people, their emotions often buried beneath layers of discipline and logic. To see her in such a state was heart-wrenching. I couldn't understand it at first. This was just food. It wasn't anything special. It wasn't a feast. But then I realized that to them, it wasn't just sustenance. It was a symbol, a sign that they hadn't been abandoned. It was the first glimmer of hope they had seen in days. She took a slow, shuddering breath, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think we would make it. The tears fell freely now, streaming down her cheeks, and the others, seeing her vulnerability, began to weep as well. It wasn't just the food that had broken them. It was the overwhelming realization that they were not alone, that, despite the odds, someone cared enough to help. I watched, feeling a lump form in my throat. This was what humanity was capable of, compassion, even in the darkest of times. I was the only human among them, but that didn't matter. We had a bond now. I didn't give up on you, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I promised I wouldn't leave you behind. Kelari wiped her eyes, shaking her head in disbelief. Why? Why help us? We are not your kind. We have done nothing for you. I smiled, though it was a bitter smile. Sometimes it's not about what you've done for me. It's about what you need. The Vokari were silent for a moment, digesting my words. Then, one by one, they began to take the food I had brought, their hands trembling with gratitude. The next few days were a blur of activity. I distributed the rations, rationing out what I had found as best I could. The Vokari, no longer on the brink of death, slowly began to regain their strength. Their energy returned, and so did their hope. They began to work together again, gathering what supplies they could from the wreckage, using their advanced technology to try and repair what little was salvageable. But it wasn't enough. The ship would never fly again. We would never leave this planet. The realization settled in like a heavy weight. Yet, there was a new sense of unity between us. We were no longer strangers. We were no longer survivors clinging to their own individual hopes. We were a team. As the days turned into weeks, we settled into a rhythm. I taught them how to grow food using the resources I could find, and they shared their knowledge of technology, attempting to create devices that could help us communicate with any passing ships. The Vokari, despite their advanced abilities, had never encountered a species quite like humans. We were resilient, adaptable, and unyielding in the face of adversity. In turn, they taught me about their culture, their history, and their strange yet beautiful way of life. I learned that their tears were not a sign of weakness, but a symbol of gratitude. Their emotional restraint was a means of preserving peace. But when their bonds were truly tested, they would cry, not because they were fragile, but because they had found something worth holding on to. Months passed, and though I knew rescue was unlikely, I stopped thinking about it as an option. The planet was our home now, and we would make the best of it. I had family here, in the most unexpected of ways. The Vokari had become my friends, my companions, and my family. I often thought back to that moment when I had handed Kelari the food. It wasn't just a simple act of kindness. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a reminder that even in the most dire circumstances, humanity, our compassion, our capacity for empathy, would always shine through. And that, I realized, was what made us truly unique. It was not our strength or our intellect or our technology. It was our hearts and the ability to give when we had nothing left to offer. In the end, that was what saved us all. You said,